The velvet box was empty. I stood in my mother's closet at 4:52 in the afternoon on a Thursday in October, holding a box that should have weighed almost nothing and somehow felt heavier than anything I had held in my life. Empty velvet has a sound when you close it, a soft, final little collapse, like a breath let out and never taken back in. I closed it anyway. Then I opened it again, because some part of me thought maybe the light was wrong. Maybe I hadn't looked hard enough. Maybe grief was playing a trick on my eyes the way it had been playing tricks on everything else for 6 months. Not to me. Not this. Not the ring. I had spent 11 years driving to that house every Sunday. I had spent the last 4 months of my mother's life sleeping in a recliner 8 feet from her bed, so she would never wake up alone. And I was still, after all of that, the last person in the family to find out that everything she left behind had already been sold, some of it before she was even 6 months in the ground. My sister had done it quietly, carefully, piece by piece, so no single gap would ever be noticed on its own. She had no idea I knew the man who bought it. I had absolutely no plan, standing in that closet, for what I was about to do next. I only knew that I was done being the last one told the truth about my own family. My name is Diane Whitfield. I am 61 years old, and before any of this happened, I would have told you my sister and I were close in the particular, complicated way that sisters who buried both their parents together are close, bonded by shared history, loosely stitched by years of small distances neither of us ever quite closed. I would not have told you that she was capable of this. I am not sure, honestly, that I fully believe it now, even having lived through every part of what follows. Some betrayals do not get easier to accept just because you were there for the proof. I have lived my whole adult life about 6 miles outside a small town called Placer Grove, on the eastern edge of the Sacramento Valley, on 11 acres that used to be my grandfather's walnut orchard before half of it went to almonds and the other half went eventually to me. The house sits at the end of a gravel drive lined with valley oaks old enough that nobody in my family remembers who planted them. In summer the cicadas start around 4 in the afternoon and don't stop until well after dark. A sound so constant you stop hearing it as sound and start hearing it as silence with texture. In October, like it was when all of this started, the almond leaves go a color somewhere between gold and rust, and the whole property smells like dust and drying hay and, faintly, always, like the machine oil from my sewing shop out past the barn. I built that shop with my own 2 hands starting when I was 29 years old. 3 years after I married Frank and 2 years before I understood that I was going to spend most of my adult life working with fabric instead of the accounting career I trained for and quietly hated. I started out doing hemming and simple alterations for neighbors out of my kitchen. By the time I was 40, I had a proper shop, heated, insulated, for industrial machines I bought used and rebuilt myself. A cutting table I built from a door and 2 sawhorses that I never bothered to replace because it worked exactly the way I needed it to work. My hands tell the story better than I can. 32 years of pins have left permanent grooves in 3 of my fingertips. My right thumb doesn't bend quite the way it should anymore. A legacy of a rotary cutter and one moment of inattention in 2009 that I still remember with more clarity than I remember most of that whole year. I have replaced needle plates, timing belts, and bobbin cases more times than I could count, and I have never once, in 32 years, missed a wedding deadline. People in 3 counties know my name because of hems and zippers, and the particular way I can make a 40-year-old wedding dress fit a granddaughter without anyone being able to tell it was ever taken apart. Frank died 8 years ago this coming January. Heart sudden, no warning, no goodbye. He went out to start the truck on a cold morning and simply didn't come back inside. I do not tell that part of my story often, not because it still breaks something open in me every single time, though it does, but because I have learned that grief, when you share too much of it too early, makes people uncomfortable in a way they don't know how to hide. What I will say is this. For 2 years after Frank died, my mother called me every single morning at 7 o'clock, not to check on me. She always insisted, but because she said she liked hearing another voice in the house before the day really started. I understood, eventually, that this was her checking on me the entire time. She was too proud, and too much like me, to ever say it directly. That is the kind of woman my mother was. Eleanor Whitfield, Ellie, to everyone who loved her, Worked 41 years as a bookkeeper for the same feed and grain supply company in town. Raised two daughters mostly alone after our father left when I was 9 and my sister was 6, and never once, in my memory, asked another living soul for help she didn't absolutely need. She kept a jewelry box on her dresser that was not particularly valuable in dollar terms and was, to both of her daughters, worth more than the house itself. There was her mother's engagement ring, a small old-cut diamond in a worn yellow gold band, the metal soft and thin now from 80 years of a woman's hand moving through the world. There was a strand of pearls my father gave her the year before he left, which she wore exactly twice a year for the rest of her life, Christmas Eve and her own birthday, a fact I never once heard her explain and never once asked her to. There was a gold locket with a photograph of my sister and me at ages 4 and 7, the edges worn soft and rounded from being opened and closed 10,000 times over 60 years. None of it would have fetched a fortune at an appraiser's counter. All of it together was the entire physical record of who my mother had been. I should say more about my mother's illness, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. Pancreatic cancer, for anyone who has not walked through it with someone they love, is not a single event. It is a long series of small losses stacked one on top of the other until the person you knew is still present in the room, but has become, in 100 small ways, someone slightly different from who they were a season before. My mother lost her appetite first, then her ability to garden, then, slowly, her ability to stand at the stove for more than a few minutes at a time. By the final 2 months, she could no longer climb the stairs to her own bedroom, and I moved a hospital bed into what used to be her sewing room, ironically enough, so that she would still be surrounded by fabric and thread and the particular smell of a room where careful, patient work had always happened. I learned to give her medication on a strict rotation written out on a whiteboard I kept on the wall across from her bed. I learned the specific sound her breathing made when the pain was building before she was willing to admit it out loud. I learned to sit very still in the dark at 3 in the morning, listening, the way a mother learns to listen for an infant, except in reverse, learning to listen for the sounds of someone leaving rather than someone arriving. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from that kind of vigilance, one that does not go away when the person finally passes, one that simply changes shape and settles somewhere in your body for a long time afterward. I mention all of this not to make myself the center of a story that is really about my mother and my sister, but because I think it is important for understanding exactly how raw and exposed I already was, underneath everything, by the time October arrived and Walter Kessler's phone call came in. My sister Renee is 58, 3 years younger than me, and for most of our lives I would have told you, without hesitation, that she loved our mother every bit as much as I did. She simply loved her differently, from a greater distance, with more show and less presence, the way some people do. Renee sells real estate in a mid-size office 2 towns over, drives a leased SUV that gets traded in every 3 years for a newer one, and has, for as long as I can remember, presented a version of her life to the outside world that was somewhat more polished than the version I understood to be true underneath it. I never held that against her. Some people need the shine. I have never needed it myself, but I never once thought it made her dishonest. I thought it made her Renee. She used to leave voicemails for our mother that started the exact same way every time. "Hey Mom, it's your favorite daughter." A joke that made our mother laugh every single time she heard it for over 20 years, even though, or maybe especially because, the two of us both knew it was a joke that only worked precisely because it wasn't true. I was the one who drove out every Sunday. I was the one who sat in waiting rooms. Renee was the one who called and visited on holidays and always arrived with something, flowers, a bottle of wine, a story that made our mother laugh until she had to press a hand flat against her chest. I want to be honest here, because dignity in this story is not going to come from pretending my sister was without warmth. She had real warmth. That is, in some ways, what makes everything that follows so much harder to sit with. Our mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before she died. I moved into her guest room within the first month and stayed, on and off, until the end. I gave up most of my shop work during that stretch, turned away 3 wedding parties, referred half my regular clients to a seamstress 2 towns over, and told everyone the same thing. which was true. My mother needed me, and there would be other seasons for sewing. Renee visited on weekends, mostly. She called during the week. In the last 6 weeks, when our mother could no longer really speak in full sentences, it was my hand she reached for at 2 in the morning when the pain broke through the medication. And it was my name, more often than not, that she said when she surfaced from sleep confused about where she was. She used to leave a mug of coffee for me on the kitchen counter before she got too sick to make it herself. Not because I asked her to, and not with a note, just the coffee, hot, waiting. Every morning I stayed over, for years before the diagnosis even came. That was how she told me she was glad I was there. She never needed to say it out loud. I understood the coffee. My mother died on a Tuesday morning in April, for months before all of this began, with my hand in hers and the window open to let in the smell of the almond blossoms that had just started that week. Renee arrived 40 minutes after. I do not say that with any bitterness. Some people cannot be present for the very end, and I have made my peace with that, mostly, in the months since. What I did not make peace with, what I could not have made peace with, because I did not yet know it had happened, was what my sister chose to do with what our mother left behind. At exactly 2:17 in the afternoon, 6 months and 11 days after the funeral, my sister sat across from me at my mother's own kitchen table, in my mother's own house, which we had agreed to keep listed together and had not yet sold, and told me she thought the jewelry box should probably stay right where it is for now, until we're both really ready to go through it properly. Her voice was soft. Her eyes did not quite meet mine on the word properly. I remember noticing that and letting it go. The way you let go of 100 small strange things a year without ever once connecting them to anything larger. I thought grief had simply made her cautious, the same way it had made me raw and short-tempered in ways I didn't always recognize in myself until later. I did not know, sitting across from her at that table, that the jewelry box she was so gently asking me not to open yet had already been mostly empty for 4 months. Before I describe how the truth eventually surfaced, I want to give a fuller picture of who my sister appeared to be during those first months after our mother's death, because I think it matters for understanding just how convincing the surface of all of this was, even to someone who loved her as closely as I did. My sister presents beautifully, and I do not mean that unkindly. She is the kind of woman a room notices without trying to be noticed. She dresses well, tailored blazers, real leather, jewelry of her own that always looks slightly more expensive than it probably is, though I've never once asked. She has a way of making eye contact that makes you feel, briefly, like the only interesting person in whatever room you're standing in. A skill I imagine has sold her a great many houses over the years. She hosts a Thanksgiving that could be photographed for a magazine. Her husband, Gary, works in commercial insurance and speaks mostly about golf. For most of my adult life, I looked at my sister's house, my sister's leased SUV, my sister's vacations posted 3 times a year to social media, and simply assumed, the way you assume things about people you love without asking, that she was doing fine, better than fine. Renee had always been the sister who landed on her feet. The first thing that struck me as slightly wrong, looking back on it now with the clarity that only comes after the fact, was small enough that I nearly didn't register it as anything at all. It was late June, 2 months after the funeral, and Renee had asked to meet me at Mom's house to start just organizing things a little, nothing final. We spent maybe 90 minutes going through kitchen cabinets and a hallway closet. At one point her phone buzzed, face down on the counter the way it always sat, and she turned it over just long enough to glance at the screen before turning it right back down again without a word. It was such a small, ordinary gesture. People do it 100 times a day, but there was something in the speed of it. The way her hand moved before her eyes had even fully processed what she'd seen, that has stayed lodged in my memory ever since. The way certain small useless details do when your subconscious understands something before the rest of you catches up. The second thing happened a few weeks later, at a family lunch that included Renee, her husband Gary, my nephew, and me. I mentioned, entirely in passing, that I was thinking of having Mom's engagement ring resized so I could wear it. My hands are close enough to my mother's that I thought it might fit almost perfectly as it was. Renee's response came a half-second too fast and a half-degree too firm. "Let's not do anything with any of that yet," she said, and reached for her water glass in a way that struck me, even in the moment, as a woman changing the subject with her whole body. I let it go. I told myself grief makes people territorial about strange things, and that this was simply Renee's version of not being ready. I want to be honest about something here. For anyone listening who has been in a similar position, I would have missed that signal too, if I hadn't already been the kind of person paying close attention to small things for most of my life. It was that subtle. It was that easy to explain away. There was a third small signal, too, one I only recognized in hindsight as belonging to the same pattern. In early September, about 5 weeks before Walter's call, Renee had asked me, over the phone, in a tone that struck me at the time as oddly formal for such a small request, whether I still had our mother's old insurance paperwork from the house. She said she wanted to make sure everything was documented properly for the estate, which seemed reasonable enough on its face. I spent an afternoon digging through a filing cabinet and found the old homeowner's policy folder, which happened to include, tucked in the back, a decade-old appraisal slip Walter himself had written up for the pearls back when Mom had them insured. I mailed Renee a photocopy of the whole folder without a second thought. It did not occur to me until much later, going back through my own memory of that autumn piece by piece, that she may have been checking, quietly, to see whether that old appraisal document, with its specific, itemized description of the pearls, was something I still had close at hand, something that might one day raise a question if the pearls were ever noticed missing. I do not know for certain that this is what that phone call was actually about. I only know that once you learn the true shape of something, your mind cannot help but go back and test every small oddity against it. The way you test a key against a lock you've just discovered was changed without your knowledge. The moment that should have told me everything, the moment I still think about more than any other, happened at my own niece's engagement party in August, for months after the funeral. Renee's oldest son had gotten engaged, and there was a small gathering at Renee's house. String lights in the backyard, a caterer, the kind of evening my sister does better than almost anyone I know. At one point, a family friend complimented Renee on a bracelet she was wearing, a slim gold piece with small worn links that looked, even from across the yard, distinctly and specifically familiar to me. I did not say anything that night. I told myself I was mistaken, that gold bracelets of that general style are not rare. That grief was making me see my mother in places she simply wasn't. I have replayed that evening in my mind more times than almost any other single memory from this entire year, because the bracelet, it turned out later, was not a coincidence at all. It had belonged to our mother since before either of us was born. The discovery itself did not come from suspicion. It came from an old family friend named Walter Kessler, and it came, of all things, on a Thursday afternoon in October, over the telephone, while I was cutting a bridesmaid's dress on the very cutting table I built with my own hands 20 years before. Walter has owned Kessler's estate jewelry and loan on Main Street in Placer Grove for almost 40 years. He bought my own wedding band's matching engagement ring from that same shop in 1987, back when it was still his father's counter he was standing behind. He knew my mother for over 3 decades. She used to bring in old costume pieces every few years just to have him look at them, more for the conversation than anything else, and he always gave her more time and more honest attention than the pieces probably warranted, because that is the kind of small-town decency that still exists in places like Placer Grove even now. He knew my mother's real jewelry, too, had appraised the pearls once for insurance purposes back in the 90s, had complimented the engagement ring more than once over the counter. In the easy way old friends compliment things they've simply seen 100 times. Walter called me directly, not Renee, because he told me later he had a feeling, his word, exactly, a feeling, that something wasn't sitting right, and that I was the daughter he trusted to handle it properly. He told me, in a voice that was careful and a little apologetic, even though he had done absolutely nothing wrong, that over the past 4 months, a woman had come into his shop on 3 separate occasions and sold him several pieces of estate jewelry. He said he hadn't thought much of it the first time. The second time, something about one of the pieces, a gold locket with a photograph worn soft at the edges, had stopped him cold behind his own counter, because he was almost certain he recognized it. The third time, 2 weeks before he called me, the woman had come in with an engagement ring, a small old-cut diamond in a worn yellow gold band, and Walter told me that when he held it up to the light, his hands had actually gone still. The way hands go still when a person's mind arrives somewhere before their mouth is ready to follow. The woman, he told me, gently, carefully, watching his own words the way a man watches his footing on ice, was my sister. I want to describe what happened in my body in that moment, because it is the only honest way I know how to tell you what discovering a betrayal actually feels like from the inside. It did not feel like anger. Anger came later, and even then it arrived in a strange, muted, delayed way, like weather that takes a full day to reach you after you've already seen the clouds on the horizon. What I felt first was cold. My hands, specifically. My hands went cold, in October, in a shop with the heater running, holding a phone that had suddenly gone slightly slippery in my grip. Everything in the room got slower. The sewing machine beside me, which had been running not 30 seconds before, seemed to have gone completely silent, though I know now it had simply been turned off, between seams the way it always is. My mind had simply stopped registering ordinary sound. Something settled low in my chest, heavy and specific, like furniture being moved into a room in my body that I had never asked to have furnished. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that too, because I think there is a version of this story people expect where the daughter breaks down sobbing over the phone, and that is simply not what happened, and I don't think pretending otherwise would serve anyone listening who has lived through something like this themselves. What happened instead was that I asked Walter, very calmly, whether he still had the receipts. He did. He had kept them. He told me, almost instinctively, the way he keeps records on any estate piece that catches his attention, and he offered, without my even having to ask, to make copies for me. He told me the dates: June the 11th, August the 3rd, September the 22nd. He told me the amounts, which I am not going to share here, because the exact dollar figures matter less than what they represented. But I will tell you that all three transactions combined came to slightly less than $4,000, which is, in the end, an almost unbearably small amount of money to have traded for the last physical pieces of our mother. Walter also told me something else, something I did not ask for and will never forget. He said that on the second visit, the day the locket stopped him cold, he had asked Renee, gently, in the easy small talk way a shop owner asks a customer, whether these pieces held any sentimental value, whether she was sure she wanted to part with them. And Renee, he told me, had smiled at him, the same warm smile she gives everyone, and said, "They're just sitting in a drawer doing nothing. My mother would want them to actually be useful to somebody." I asked Walter to repeat that sentence back to me a second time. He did. Just sitting in a drawer, doing nothing. She said it about our mother's engagement ring, about the locket with our childhood photographs inside it, about the last physical proof that a woman named Eleanor Whitfield had lived and been loved for 81 years. Doing nothing. I have thought about that phrase more times in the months since than I can count. It is not the kind of sentence you forget. It is the kind of sentence that tells you, in 7 words, exactly how someone has learned to see the things, and, underneath that, sometimes the people, that no longer serve an immediate purpose for them. Walter offered, that same afternoon, to hold anything he still had in inventory, quietly, without listing it for resale, for as long as I needed. The locket and the bracelet, it turned out, he had not yet moved along to a buyer. The engagement ring, the most recent piece, he still had sitting in his own back safe. The pearls, I would learn much later, had already been sold to a private buyer within a week of Renee bringing them in, and were, by the time I found any of this out, already gone. A fact that still, of everything in this story, is the one piece I have had the hardest time making peace with. I sat with Walter a while longer that first afternoon, because I found I could not quite make myself stand up and leave right away. He told me gently a few more details I had not asked for but was glad later to have. He told me that the first time Renee came in, back in June, she had seemed nervous in a way he found curious at the time, checking her watch twice, glancing toward the door once as though she expected someone to walk in and recognize her. By the third visit, in September, with the engagement ring, he said she had seemed calmer, more practiced, the way anyone gets more practiced at a thing they've now done more than once. That detail bothered me more than almost anything else he told me that day. It meant this had not been one desperate, isolated moment of poor judgment. It meant she had returned, deliberately, 3 separate times, becoming steadily more comfortable with what she was doing each time she did it. I drove home that afternoon along the same 2-lane road I have driven 10,000 times in my life, past the Henderson's dairy operation and the old Grange Hall and the turnoff toward the cemetery where my mother is buried, and I noticed, in a way I don't think I ever had before, how ordinary everything looked. The cows were still standing in the same field. The light was still doing the same October thing it always does, turning the hills the color of a lion's coat. It struck me, driving past all of it, that the world simply does not pause to acknowledge the moment your understanding of your own family quietly rearranges itself. It keeps right on being an ordinary Thursday for absolutely everyone else. I did not confront my sister that day. I did not confront her that week. I sat with what I knew for 11 days before I said a single word to another living soul about any of it. And I want to explain why. Because I think the instinct to explode immediately is understandable, and I think the choice not to is what ultimately made everything that followed mean something rather than simply hurt something. I did not confront her immediately because I understood, sitting in that shop with the phone still warm in my hand, that if I said anything before I had the full picture, my sister, who is, whatever else is true about her, an intelligent and quick-thinking woman, would have every opportunity to explain it away, to soften it, to reframe 4 months of quiet, deliberate selling into a single misunderstanding I would eventually feel guilty for having doubted. I had watched her do smaller versions of that my entire life. I was not going to hand her the raw material to do it with something this large. The following week, I drove into town and sat across from Walter's counter in person. He handed me copies of all 3 receipts, each one itemized in his careful handwriting. The date, the piece, a brief description, the amount paid. I photographed each page with my phone, then photographed the physical pieces themselves, still sitting in his back safe, from 3 separate angles each, the way I imagined a lawyer or an insurance adjuster might want to see them documented. I asked Walter if he would be willing, if it ever came to it, to state plainly and honestly what he had told me, in whatever setting that became necessary. He did not hesitate. Ellie was a friend of mine for 30 years, he told me. I'll say it to anybody who needs to hear it. I also called an old friend from my church congregation, a retired county sheriff's deputy named Harold Briggs, not because I believed, even for a moment, that criminal charges were the right path forward for my own sister, but because I needed someone with a clear, unemotional head to tell me honestly whether what I was looking at was as serious as it felt in the moment. Sitting alone in my own kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, Harold listened to the whole thing without interrupting me once. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I have not been able to stop turning over in my mind since. At 60, he told me, most family betrayals like this aren't really about greed the way you'd think. They're about somebody who got themselves into a hole years ago and has been quietly digging sideways ever since, hoping nobody notices the dirt piling up. The money's rarely the real story. The real story is usually what she couldn't bring herself to say to you out loud. That sentence did something to me that I did not expect. It did not excuse what my sister had done, but it reframed it in a way that let me approach what came next with something closer to clarity than pure fury. And I think that reframing mattered more than almost anything else in how the rest of the story unfolded. For the following 2 weeks, I did something that I can only describe now as the strangest performance of my entire life. I had dinner with my sister on a Sunday, the way we had every few weeks since our mother passed, and I asked her about Gary's golf handicap and complimented a new blazer she was wearing and did not, for one single second across an entire 90-minute meal, let on that I had spent that same morning photographing receipts in Walter Kessler's back office. I remember the exact texture of that dinner with unusual clarity, the specific clink of her wine glass against the edge of the table each time she set it down, the smell of the garlic bread she'd made from a recipe our mother used to make, the particular way the evening light came low and gold through her kitchen window and lit up the side of her face while she laughed at something Gary said about a client. I sat there carrying the full weight of what I knew, smiling at appropriate intervals, and I understood, somewhere in the middle of that dinner, that this was probably one of the loneliest evenings of my entire adult life, surrounded by the people I loved most and unable to say one true thing out loud to any of them. I went to work the following Monday and finished the bridesmaid's dress I had been cutting the day Walter called. I remember standing at my machine with my hands doing work they had done 10,000 times before, my body on complete autopilot, my mind somewhere else entirely, and understanding, in a way I hadn't fully understood before that week, exactly what my mother must have felt in the 2 years after our father left, the specific exhaustion of performing an ordinary day while carrying something extraordinary and unspoken directly underneath it. I spent those 2 weeks also doing something quieter and more deliberate. I began, gently and without ever raising a single flag, asking other family members small, ordinary-sounding questions. I asked my nephew, Renee's youngest, in an entirely casual tone over coffee, how his mother's real estate business had been doing lately. He told me, without any particular concern in his voice, that it had slowed down a lot over the past year, that 2 big listings had fallen through, that he'd overheard his parents discussing a rough patch more than once at the dinner table. I asked Gary himself, at that same Sunday dinner, in the most casual voice I could manage, how the market had been treating them, and watched him give the kind of vague, slightly too quick answer that told me almost as much as a direct confession would have. I began to understand, piece by piece, the fuller shape of what my sheriff friend Harold had already suspected, that Renee was not a woman who had simply decided, out of greed or malice, to steal from a dead woman's jewelry box. She was a woman who had, for reasons I did not yet fully understand, quietly buried herself in debt behind a very well-maintained surface, and had made a choice alone, in a moment I will never fully know the details of, to solve part of that problem with the only asset she had access to that nobody else was watching closely enough to notice was missing. None of that, I want to be clear, made what she did acceptable. It simply made it human, and understanding it as human, rather than as pure villainy, is part of what allowed me to walk into what came next with a steady hand instead of a shaking one. There was one more piece of preparation I have not yet mentioned, one I almost didn't do at all, because it felt, at the time, uncomfortably close to something my sister herself might have done. I drove to the county recorder's office on a Wednesday morning during that same 2-week stretch and pulled the title history on our mother's house, the one Renee and I still jointly owned and had not yet sold, simply to make certain nothing had quietly shifted there as well while I wasn't looking. It hadn't. The title was exactly as it should have been, both our names still listed cleanly. No liens, no surprises. I remember the specific relief of standing at that counter, an $11 copy fee receipt in my hand, understanding that whatever else had happened, the house itself was still whole. I tell this part of story because I think it matters for anyone listening who is sitting in a similar season of uncertainty with a sibling right now. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do isn't confrontation at all. Sometimes it's simply quiet verification, done calmly, so that whatever comes next, you are standing on solid, confirmed ground rather than assumption. I also spent one evening during that stretch going through old photographs with my nephew, ostensibly to choose a few for a small memorial collage his college had asked our family to contribute for a scholarship fund set up in our mother's name. It was, if I am honest, partly a genuine errand and partly an excuse to sit with someone I trusted completely and simply be normal for an hour, to remember out loud who our mother had actually been before any of the last several months had happened. We found a photograph from 1974, my mother maybe 30 years old, laughing at something outside the frame, wearing the same pearls, 24 years before either Renee or I would exist to inherit them. I kept that photograph. It sits now beside the shadow box on my bedroom wall, and some mornings I look at it before I look at anything else in the room. By the end of those 2 weeks, I had everything organized in a single manila folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my cutting table, underneath a stack of pattern paper where I knew no one would ever think to look. 3 itemized receipts, dated and signed by Walter. Photographs of the recovered pieces from 3 angles each. A brief written timeline, in my own handwriting, matching each sale date against family events. A birthday, a holiday, an ordinary Tuesday, so that anyone looking at it later would understand exactly how long this had been quietly happening underneath the surface of otherwise normal family life. And tucked at the very back of the folder, A single handwritten note from Walter himself, dated and signed, repeating word for word what my sister had said to him the day she sold the locket. Just sitting in a drawer, doing nothing. I decided, in the end, not to confront my sister privately. I want to explain that choice honestly, because I know some people listening will feel it was harsh, and I have made my peace with that possibility. I chose instead to wait for the one occasion already planned on the calendar that involved our entire immediate family in one room together. A small gathering, 3 weeks later, at Renee's own house, technically framed as a joint effort to finally, properly go through the last of our mother's remaining belongings and decide together what to do with the house itself. Renee had chosen the setting herself, months earlier, before any of this had come to light. Her own dining room, her own home, where she had always been the most composed and the most in control. I understood, walking up her front steps that Saturday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a folder inside a plain canvas bag that also happened to hold a sewing kit I told her I'd brought along in case anyone needed a button fixed before a family photo later that day. That her comfort in that room was about to become the very thing that made everything I was about to say land as hard as it needed to land. The dining room smelled like the pot roast Renee had been cooking since morning, and the late October light came in gold and low through the west-facing window behind her chair, the same window I had once complimented her on choosing, years earlier, when she and Gary first bought the house. Gary sat at the head of the table. My nephew and his fiancée sat across from me. Renee sat directly across from me as well, in the chair she always sat in the house where she had always felt, more than anywhere else in her adult life, completely and permanently in control. I let the early part of the conversation unfold exactly the way everyone expected it to. We talked about the house listing, about a leaking roof section the inspector had flagged, about which of Mom's remaining furniture pieces anyone actually wanted. My voice did not shake. My hands, folded in my lap under the table, did not shake either, though I will admit, honestly, that my heart was doing something closer to what it does at the top of a roller coaster than anything resembling calm. I understood in that moment, the calmest person at that table, and I understood, somewhere underneath the calm, that this fact alone had already changed the balance of the entire room, even before I said a single word about what I actually knew. At what I later checked was almost exactly 4 in the afternoon, in a natural lull in the conversation, I reached into the canvas bag at my feet and set the manila folder, closed, in the center of the table. Before we talk about the house, I said, there's something I think everyone at this table has a right to see. I want to be honest that I had rehearsed almost nothing beyond that single sentence. I trusted, correctly as it turned out, that the folder itself would do most of the work I needed done. Renee's face did something in that moment that I will remember for the rest of my life. A flicker, quick and almost imperceptible, if you hadn't already been waiting for it, of the exact same expression she'd had the day her phone buzzed face down on our mother's kitchen counter. I opened the folder and laid the first receipt flat on the table, facing her, facing everyone. June the 11th. Item, gold locket, vintage, engraved. I did not raise my voice reading it. I did not need to. That's Mom's locket, my nephew said quietly, before anyone else had spoken, and I watched something in Renee's shoulders drop half an inch. I laid down the second receipt. August the 3rd. Item, gold link bracelet, estate. You wore this to your own son's engagement party, I said, still to Renee, still without raising my voice. I recognized it that night. I told myself I was wrong. The third receipt. September the 22nd. Item, gold band, old European cut diamond solitaire, engagement ring. The room had gone almost completely silent by then, silent enough that I could hear, faintly, the pot roast still simmering in the kitchen behind us. Those are edited, Renee said, and her voice, when it finally came, was thinner than I had ever heard it. That's Diane. That's not what it looks like. I have the physical pieces, I said. They're sitting in Walter Kessler's safe right now. He's held on to them for weeks, because something about it didn't sit right with him either. I let that settle for a moment before I continued. Walter's known this family for 30 years. He's willing to say, to anyone who needs to hear it, exactly what you told him when you sold that locket. Renee's hands moved toward the receipts on the table, Not to grab them. Exactly. More the reflexive motion of someone trying to physically stop information from existing simply by touching it. Gary's hand came down gently over hers. Not to comfort her. I understood watching it. But almost to still her. The way you'd still a hand reaching toward something hot. I can pay it back, Renee said next, her voice climbing slightly. Diane, I can get you the money, all of it. I just need it. She stopped herself. This was never about the money, I said, and I meant it completely. It was never going to be about the money. There was a stretch of maybe 10 seconds of complete silence, and I want to describe what happened in that silence honestly, because it is the part of the story I think about the most. My sister's face, for just a moment, was not the composed, polished face she presents to the world. It was the face of a woman I recognized from 40 years earlier, 9 years old, standing in our childhood kitchen the week our father left, holding a cereal bowl she'd broken by accident and waiting to find out how much trouble she was in. I felt, in that 10-second silence, something I had not expected to feel at all in that moment, something complicated and uncomfortable, sitting right alongside everything else. A flicker of genuine grief, not for the jewelry, not even entirely for myself, but for whatever it was that had made my sister feel, at some point in the last several years, that this was a door she could walk through quietly rather than a problem she could bring to me directly. I did not let that flicker soften what came next, because I understood that softening it too early would only teach her, once again, that there were no real consequences waiting on the other side of a decision like this one. I already know some of it, I said, gently but plainly, looking at her directly. I know the market's been hard for you this last year. I know you and Gary have been carrying more than either of you have said out loud at this table. I want you to know I understand that part. What I don't understand, and what I need you to explain to me honestly, is why you didn't come to me. I would have found a way to help. Instead, you decided our mother's things were just sitting in a drawer, doing nothing. And you made that decision for both of us without ever once asking me. I watched the second receipt's exact phrase land on her the way I had hoped it would. I saw recognition cross her face, the specific horror of hearing your own private words repeated back to you in front of your husband and your son. Gary, to his credit, did not defend her in that moment, and did not attack her either. He sat very still, his jaw tight, and I understood, watching him, that this was very likely the first he was learning the full scope of it as well, and that whatever conversation was waiting for the two of them later that night was going to be a difficult one that had nothing to do with me. It was my nephew, in the end, who asked the question that finally cracked the room fully open. Mom, he said, quiet, not accusing, genuinely asking, how much do you actually owe? Renee did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all of its earlier polish. A lot, she said, more than I ever told either of you. And then, almost to herself, barely audible, I didn't know how to say it out loud. I want to be honest that the room did not erupt after that. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, no scene worthy of television. What happened instead was quieter and, in its own way, harder to sit through. A long, uncomfortable unraveling of a story my sister had clearly been holding alone for close to 2 years, about a failed second listing partnership, about money borrowed against her own house that Gary hadn't fully known about until recently, about a slow, private slide she had been managing entirely by herself, the way some people manage things by never once saying them out loud to anyone who might actually help. I did not offer forgiveness at that table, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think there is a version of this story people expect where the sister cries and the family embraces and everything resolves neatly within the hour. And that is not what happened, and I don't think pretending otherwise would be honest to anyone listening who has lived through something similar. What I offered, instead, was one plain, calm statement before I stood up from that table. I'm going to buy back what Walter still has. I told her. The locket, the bracelet, the ring. I'll pay him what he's owed, and those 3 pieces come back into this family, to me, and I will decide later, when I'm ready, what happens to them next. The pearls are already gone, and I don't know that we'll ever get those back, and I need you to sit with that, because I have had to. I paused, and I need some time before I know what our relationship looks like after today. I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it because it's true. Before I stood up to leave, there was one more exchange at that table I feel I owe the full account of, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has ever wondered what actually happens in the minutes after a confrontation like this one. Once the initial shock has already passed, and the room is left to sit with what's been said. Renee's fiancée, my nephew's fiancée, I should say, a quiet young woman named Priya, who had said almost nothing the entire afternoon, reached across the table at one point and simply put her hand over Renee's, not in judgment, but in a small, human gesture of steadiness. The kind you offer someone you can see is drowning even if you don't yet fully understand why. It was such a small thing. It has stayed with me anyway, because it reminded me that whatever else was true about that afternoon, my sister was still, to the people around that table, someone worth extending a small kindness to even in her worst moment, and I think that mattered, both for her and for how the rest of the year unfolded. Gary spoke once more before I left, quietly, mostly to me rather than to Renee. I didn't know the full amount, he said. I knew some of it. I didn't know all of it. I believed him. I still believe him now. Whatever my sister had been doing, she had, it seemed, been carrying most of it alone, hidden not just from me but, in its fullest shape, from her own husband as well, a fact that has made me, in the months since, feel something closer to sadness for her than I ever expected to feel walking out of that house. I left before dessert. I do not know to this day exactly what was said at that table after I walked out the front door into the cooling October evening, and I have chosen, deliberately, not to ask. I sat in my car in Renee's driveway for close to 20 minutes before I turned the key, and I want to describe that 20 minutes honestly, because it was not triumphant, and it did not feel like winning anything. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, not driving anywhere, listening to the tick of the engine cooling, and, somewhere down the block, a dog barking at something in the growing dark. I did not cry, though I came close twice. Mostly I felt still, in a way I had not felt in the 11 days since Walter's phone call, the particular stillness that comes after you have finally said the thing you have been carrying silently for far too long. What surprised me most, sitting there in that driveway, was not anger, though anger was certainly present, somewhere underneath everything else. What surprised me was grief, a fresh, specific grief, different from the grief I had already been carrying for my mother, grief for the version of my sister I had believed in for 58 years, and grief, too, for whatever private fear or shame had convinced her that hiding this from me was a safer choice than trusting me with the truth. I sat with all of that for a long time before I finally drove home in the dark, past the almond orchards, past the walnut trees my grandfather had planted, back to the house, where a coffee mug my mother had left for me 100 mornings still sat, unwashed on purpose, on a shelf above my kitchen sink. I went to see Walter Kessler the following Monday morning, and bought back all 3 remaining pieces at exactly what he'd paid for them, refusing, gently but firmly, his offer to simply give them back to me for nothing. Your mother would want it done properly, I told him, and he understood exactly what I meant without needing me to explain any further. I spent an hour after that, standing at his counter with the 3 pieces laid out on a soft black cloth in front of me. The locket, the bracelet, the engagement ring, my mother's whole physical history, sitting under the same shop lights that had watched 3 generations of Placer Grove families come and go. The estate sale of Renee and Gary's old SUV happened, from what I understand, on a Saturday morning about 6 weeks after that dinner, in their own driveway, to a young couple from 2 towns over who were simply looking for a reliable used vehicle at a fair price. My nephew told me about it almost in passing, and I remember sitting with that detail for a long while afterward, the specific ordinariness of it, a leased luxury vehicle traded down for something plainer and fully owned, no fanfare, no explanation offered to the neighbors who might have noticed. I think, in its own quiet way, that driveway sale said more about the real shift happening inside my sister's life than almost anything said at that dining room table weeks earlier. Words are easy to arrange carefully. Selling your own car in your own driveway on a Saturday morning is not. I found the pearls, eventually, 3 weeks later, through a private estate jewelry buyer in Sacramento, whose contact information Walter helped me track down. I paid nearly 4 times what my sister had received for them originally, and I did not tell her, for a long time, that I had found them at all. Some things, I decided, I was allowed to keep quietly for myself. Renee's financial situation, as far as I understand it now, some 7 months on from that afternoon at her dining room table, has not been magically resolved. She and Gary sold the leased SUV and now drive a used sedan that Gary bought outright, in cash, from a private seller. Their household has, from what my nephew tells me and the careful, diplomatic way adult children describe their parents' finances, gotten a lot more honest with itself over the last several months. She has not sold a house professionally, as far as I know, since the spring, and has instead taken a part-time bookkeeping job at a small accounting firm 2 towns over, work that our own mother, I have thought more than once, would have found a certain quiet satisfaction in. I have not returned to the closeness we once had, and I want to be honest that I do not know, even now, whether we ever fully will. We speak. We have had 2 more dinners since that October afternoon, both of them careful, both of them shorter than they used to be, both of them, I think, honest in a way our relationship simply wasn't before any of this happened. She has apologized to me twice, in 2 very different ways, once early on, still somewhat defensive, still somewhat focused on her own circumstances, and once, for months later, on the phone on a Sunday evening, with no defensiveness in it at all, just a long silence, and then the words, "I should have just asked you for help. I don't know why I couldn't." I told her, that second time, that I understood more than she probably realized, and that I was glad she'd finally said it. I did not tell her, because I did not think it would help either of us in that moment. That understanding is not the same thing as forgetting, and that some part of me will likely carry the sound of that closing velvet box for the rest of my life. 1 year later, almost to the week, I sit in the same sewing shop I built with my own hands 33 years ago, at the same cutting table, and the light comes through the west window in October the exact same gold it always has. My mother's engagement ring sits on my right hand now, resized to fit me almost perfectly, and I catch myself, several times a week, simply looking at it while I work, the way you look at a small quiet fact that has quietly become one of the steadiest things in your life. The locket sits in a shadow box on my bedroom wall, next to a photograph of my mother from her own wedding day, along with the pearls, displayed rather than worn, because some things, I've decided, deserve to simply be looked at and remembered rather than used. I have thought often, this past year, about the difference between the family we present to the world and the family we actually are underneath that presentation, and I think this whole experience has left me gentler, in some ways, about other people's carefully maintained surfaces than I used to be. I used to see a nice car or a well-decorated house and simply take it, uncritically, as evidence of a life that was going fine. I no longer make that assumption quite so easily, not because I've become suspicious of everyone around me, but because I understand now, in a way I didn't fully understand before, how much effort some people put into making sure nobody ever has to know they're struggling, and how lonely that effort must be to maintain, year after year, all by yourself. I have also thought a great deal about my mother, and what she would have made of all of this, and I have landed, eventually, somewhere I did not expect to land. I do not think she would have wanted this story to end in permanent estrangement. I think she would have wanted exactly what eventually happened. The truth said plainly, the consequences allowed to be real, and the relationship, imperfect and still healing, given the chance to continue rather than being severed outright. My mother believed, more than almost anyone I've ever known, that people could be held fully accountable and still be loved at the same time, that those 2 things were never actually in competition with each other the way we sometimes assume they are. I think, more than anything else I've come to understand this year, that lesson is the one she would most want passed along. Walter still owns the shop on Main Street, and I stop in every few months now, mostly just to talk, the same way my mother used to. My nephew got married in the spring, and I altered his bride's dress myself, the same way I have altered dresses for half the families in this town over 3 decades, and I wore my mother's pearls to the wedding for the first time in my life, on a Saturday, not a holiday, simply because I finally understood that I no longer needed to save them for only 2 days a year. Renee was at that wedding too, seated 3 tables from me, and at one point in the evening, watching her dance with her own son, I felt something in my chest that was not quite forgiveness, and not quite its absence either. Something more complicated and more honest than either of those simple words. Something closer, I think, to the specific and unglamorous work of continuing to love a person you no longer fully trust the same way you once did. If there's one truth this whole year has left me with, it is this. Grief does not reveal who people are. It simply removes, for a little while, everyone's ability to hide it. What my sister did in the 4 months after our mother died was not really about jewelry, and it was never really about money either, not underneath it. It was about a woman so afraid of being seen as failing that she chose secrecy over honesty, even with the one person in her life who had never once, in 58 years, turned her away when she actually asked for help. If you are listening to this, and you are the sibling who handled everything, the appointments, the nights, the impossible last months, and you are only now discovering that someone else in your family made a private decision about what was left behind without ever once including you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your grief was not wasted just because someone else's dishonesty complicated it. What you gave in those final months belonged entirely to the person you gave it to. Nobody can retroactively take that back from you, no matter what they did afterward. If you are the adult child watching a parent quietly circle a financial hole they're too proud or too frightened to name out loud, I want you to hear this too. The kindest thing you can sometimes do is simply ask the plain, uncomfortable question directly, before silence gives that hole any more time to grow. If you are the person right now sitting on some version of my sister's side of the story, carrying a debt, or a shame, or a fear you have not said out loud to the one person who has never actually turned you away, please hear this, because it may be the single most useful thing I can offer you. The people who love you would almost always rather sit through one hard, honest conversation than discover, months or years later, that you decided alone they couldn't be trusted with the truth. And if you are the person who did the discovering, the way I did, if you are sitting with a version of that empty velvet box in your own hands right now, please hear this last thing clearly. You loved correctly. Whatever someone else did with what you gave them does not undo the fact that you gave it honestly, completely, and without keeping score. You loved correctly. They acted incorrectly. Those are two completely different things, and only one of them is actually yours to carry. I want to say one more thing before I close, something that took me almost a full year to fully understand about my own part in this story. For a long time after that October afternoon, I quietly believed that if I had simply paid closer attention sooner, noticed the phone turn face down a little faster, pressed harder on the bracelet at the engagement party, asked one more direct question at that very first lunch when Renee changed the subject so quickly, I might have caught this before it went as far as it did. I have since let most of that particular guilt go, and I want to offer that release to anyone listening who might be quietly carrying a version of it themselves. You are not responsible for noticing every small inconsistency in someone else's carefully maintained story. People who are determined to hide something from you will very often succeed, at least for a while, no matter how closely you love them or how carefully you're paying attention. The failure, when there is one, belongs to the person doing the hiding, not to the person who simply trusted them the way any reasonable person trusts their own sister. If any part of tonight's story landed close to home, here's one small, practical thing you can do this week. If you share any inherited or family property with a sibling, a house, a storage unit, a safety deposit box, anything neither of you has fully gone through yet, ask, plainly and directly, for a joint, written inventory. Even a simple handwritten list will do, of exactly what's there right now. It costs nothing. It takes an afternoon, and it is far easier to have that conversation now, while everything is still in front of both of you, than to have the one I had to have, 3 weeks later, across a dining room table that wasn't even mine. I'll leave you with the question I have been sitting with all year, the one I don't think I'll ever fully stop asking myself. Is there a debt, or a fear, or a private shame you have been quietly carrying alone, convinced that the people who love you couldn't handle the truth of it? And if so, what exactly are you protecting them from? Because I have to wonder, more and more the further I get from that October afternoon, whether it was ever really them you were protecting at all. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe Diane handled this exactly the right way, calm, documented, and face-to-face with her whole family in the room. Drop a 2 if part of you still feels for Renee, and you think there's more complicated pain underneath a story like this than any of us can fully see from the outside. Drop a 3 if some piece of this story touched something real and specific in your own life, something you've never quite said out loud to anyone either. Tell me where you're watching this from, and what time it is there right now. Someone is going to watch this at 2 in the morning from somewhere I would never expect, and somehow it's going to be exactly the story they needed tonight. That means something to me every single time I read these comments, and I read every single one. If this story felt like it understood something about your own family, consider staying with us here. This channel isn't built for entertainment. It's built for people who have lived through the quiet, complicated parts of love and loss that don't usually make it into anyone else's stories. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Placer Grove, California, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, locations, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in this story matched your real life too closely, please reach out to a licensed attorney, an elder financial abuse hotline, or a counselor you trust. You are not alone. And remember, sometimes the truth does not arrive with a crash. Sometimes it is just a quiet sound, an empty velvet box closing, that you finally stopped ignoring. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.